I realized a while back that I had done videos on how to build the bee vacuum, but I hadn't really explained a lot about why it's designed the way it is and what it's supposed to do. So this is the bee vacuum. I use a portable vacuum with it. Now the reason for using a portable vacuum is when I go places to pick up bees, I don't have to worry about plugging in somewhere. Even if you have an adapter in your car that generates power for you, you can't always park your vehicle close to where you're going to do the work. So this really works for me. I usually take two 20-volt batteries, and I've never had a situation where I had ran out of power with the two batteries. So I'm just going to take this off for the time being. So when do you use a bee vacuum? Probably the most common situation is where you have a cutout, where you're doing the removal of a hive that's already installed in some building or something else like that. But it's also valuable if you have a hive, a swarm, in a place that's kind of hard to get to, or that the people don't want you cutting branches and things like this off of them. I've had situations where they're in the middle of a brush, and a brush type tree thing, and it's easier for me to just go in there with the bee vacuum and suck them up than it is to scoop up a certain number of bees, because what I have to do if I scoop them, I have to make sure that I get the queen. I can scoop them and dump them in a box, and if I haven't gotten the queen, they're going to leave and go back to where the queen is. If I have the queen, then sure, they'll come in and they'll all go into the box and everything will be hunky-dory. But at least with the bee vacuum, I know that I can pick up all of the bees. Okay, so the bee vacuum was really designed to reduce stress on bees and to make the transfer of the bees from the bee vacuum into a hive easy and stress-free. To do that, I'll talk about how you use it. So what you do is, after you've collected the bees, you sit this on top of a large, full-size, a deep brood box. And that deep brood box would contain frames. Hopefully that would have drawn comb. If you're doing a cutout, then of course you take the comb from the cutout and you put it into the frames, and then you put the bees in on top of it. But if you're doing a swarm, then you're going to have frames with, maybe if you have some existing drawn comb, you can use that. Otherwise, you're going to use foundation. So you have the bees in the box, and they're down in here. So you sit this on top of the deep, and then you pull out this slide that's underneath here. Okay. And then what I do is I take this filler and I stick the filler in here. The reason for doing that is that this slot is actually big enough that the bees can get through, and I want to make the bees go through the front of the hive. What I've also done when I am transferring to a hive, I put an excluder between the bottom board and the deep. And the reason for doing that is to trap the queen in the hive. She can't get through the excluder, so she's not going to be able to lead that swarm or hive, whatever you have, and leave. Now if you're doing a cutout and you've taken comb that contains brood, they're probably going to stay because they really very rarely ever abandon brood. But if you're doing a swarm, it's very common that this wonderful hive that you have that has everything they need, they decide that that's really not what they want. you come back later in the day and the hive is empty. But if you put the excluder underneath the deep box, they're not going to leave because the queen is not going to be able to get out. So that they're trapped in there. Once the queen starts laying and producing brood, you can take that excluder off. And you do need to remove that excluder because eventually they will make drones, and the drones won't be able to get through the excluder and they will be trapped. So when I went through several generations or several revisions of this bee vacuum. And one of the things I wound up with, the first one I made was similar to this, except it had just a screen on the top. And I picked up a swarm, sat this on top, waited for the swarm to move down into the deep. No, they didn't. They started making comb up here in the bee vacuum. So I decided that what I needed was a way to force the bees down into the hive. And that's where this slide mechanism comes from. So when I put the bees in, I start to push them down with this slide. Okay. Now you can't push them all the way down because you're going to crush the bees. They're going to sort of be trapped between the slide and the frames. So I have these screws here which allow me to step it in different levels. So I'll go ahead to the first level and I'll leave the bees for a while, and I'll come back and I'll move each of these to the next screw. Okay, and that puts it further down. If I want to push it all the way down, I can go to the no steps and push the bees all the way in. But usually getting them to this step, there's a little bit of space between the slide and the top of the frames, but they will move down into the frames, usually by the next day. So it makes it does a couple of things. One, it guarantees that the queen is in the hive, providing that you have the queen in the bee vacuum. And second, it lowers the stress on the bees, because usually if you take a regular bee vacuum, you dump the bees into the hive and they're flying all over the place, and that is kind of stressful on the bees. This one, I believe, is less stressful on the bees because they're clustered together, which is common for them and which they feel okay in, and you just barely push them down into the hive, forcing them to do their building and work as they into the frames that you put in there. I'm going to get a hive, and I'll demonstrate some of this in the next section here. Okay, after you pick up your bees, either as a cutout or picking up a swarm, you're going to have the bees in the bee vacuum. And the bee vacuum has a screen in the top. When you transport the bees, you want to transport them without the top. You want to have this to allow air flow and cooling. The bees clustered together generate a fair amount of heat, and if you don't provide some type of cooling, some way for the heat to get out, they can actually die from overheating. So no top, don't put the top on them when you transport them. Carry them in your car or whatever. They're going to be perfectly safe. They're enclosed in the box. They're not going to be able to get out and get at you. When you set up your hive, you want to put an excluder on the bottom board. And then here I have a deep brood box, and I have foundation frames with foundation in it. If you did a cutout, you would have taken the comb from the cutout, especially the comb that contains brood. So you want to move quickly because you don't want that brood to get chilled. Normally you're doing these things in warmer weather, so you have a good chance of being able to keep the brood alive. you mount the brood in a frame. Of course, not with this foundation, but an empty frame. And how you mount it is another discussion. But anyway, you mount the brood, and you put the brood comb into the hive. Then you take the bee vacuum, and you put the bee vacuum on top of the hive, just like this. Okay? And remove the slide in the bottom. That allows the bees to move down into the hive. Since there's an excluder down there, the queen will not be able to get out of the hive and will pretty much be trapped. The bees, the worker bees, will be able to go in and out freely, but the queen will not be able to get out. And eventually, they'll decide that they really like this home and they're going to use it. And they'll start to draw comb. She'll start to lay eggs in it. And once you have brood in the brood box, you can remove the excluder. You don't have to hurry to do that, but no more than a couple of weeks anyway, I would think, and then remove it. The long-term problem is eventually you'll make drones, and the drones will get captured in here. But anyway, after you pull out the slide, I usually put in this little piece, which is a blocker. It just fills up, or filler. It just fills up that hole of that thing where the slide was, so bees can't get in and out of this place here. Then I'm going to tilt this. I normally wouldn't, but okay. And I go ahead and start to push this slide, down. And I have the ropes on the second notch. So what I've done, turn it the other way, you can see I have pushed it down, and there's room underneath the slide. Looks like maybe about 3 inches. So the bees are now going to be on top of the frames, but they're going to be pushed down somewhat. You can't push them down all at once because they just won't move that fast. And what you do is squash the bees if you tried it. So I take them to the first notch. I go away, maybe cover them. Okay, put a cover on them. And then I go away for a couple hours. Come back in a couple hours, take them down to the next notch. And that pushes them down to maybe about a little over an inch, maybe an inch and a half. Okay, they're really being pushed, encouraged to go down into the brood box, and leave them. And the way I do it is I usually leave them overnight, and by morning they have usually moved down into the box into a cluster to keep warm. At that time, you can pull the slide back up again just to reset everything. Okay, and I usually do this afterwards. Take out the filler, stick the slide back in, put the top on, and you got a hive. All right. Next, I'll talk about using the bee vacuum to get a swarm that's high in the tree without having to climb up into the tree itself. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about how I use this to access bees that are high up in a tree. So this is the way I'd be set up normally. I'd have the vacuum and I would just process the bees through here into the hive. But when they're high up in the tree, I need some way to reach them, and what I've done is got this 10-foot piece of plastic pipe. I hook the hose into the plastic pipe using duct tape. And now I can reach up here 10 feet easily. And if I need to go higher than that, I'll get a step ladder, maybe an 8-foot step ladder, which gives me an extra, at least 5 feet or so of height, and allows me to pick up swarms that are up in the tree that I wouldn't want to climb up to get. At my age, laying a ladder against the tree and climbing up there is just not something I want to do. If I was to fall out of the tree at my age, I'd probably hurt myself pretty badly. If I fall off a step ladder, it's not quite so bad. But anyway, I've used it for that a number of times, and works pretty well. The bees wind up in the bee vacuum, and then you process the bees the way I described earlier. Thank you.